I didn't say a word when Sandra Morrison, the HOA president, stood up at that packed community meeting and announced they were auctioning off my lake lot for unpaid assessments. I just sat there in the back row watching her wave around what she thought was legal paperwork. Listening to her explain how they'd finally be rid of the problem property that had been dragging down neighborhood values. The room was full of my neighbors, most of them nodding along, a few shooting uncomfortable glances my way. Sandra's voice got louder as she talked about turning my grandfather's old fishing cabin into something more appropriate for our community standards. That's when I stood up, walked to the front of that stuffy little meeting room in the community center, and placed a manila folder on the table right in front of her. I opened it to reveal the original 1962 county road easement deed, with my family name listed as the sole owners of the private access road that every single person in Pinecrest Estates used to get to their million-dollar homes. The silence that followed was the sweetest sound I'd heard in 3 years. But let me back up, because this whole mess started long before that meeting, back when I actually believed that good neighbors could work things out like reasonable adults. I inherited my grandfather's property in 2019, after he passed away at 91. It wasn't much to look at, a modest 2-bedroom cabin built in the 1960s. Sitting on 3 acres of prime lakefront property on the north end of what would eventually become Pine Lake, the cabin needed work. Sure. But it had good bones, and the most beautiful view of the water you've ever seen. Every morning, I'd sit on the screened porch with my coffee, watching the mist rise off the lake while the loons called to each other across the water. Grandpa had bought the land back when it was still considered out in the sticks, long before the developers showed up with their grand plans for luxury lakefront living. The deed was straightforward, 3 acres of waterfront property, plus ownership of the quarter-mile gravel road that connected the cabin to the main county highway. Back then, that road didn't matter much to anyone except Grandpa and the occasional fisherman who knew about the good base spots near his dock. The trouble began in 2021, about 6 months after I'd moved into the cabin full-time. I'd taken early retirement from my job as a civil engineer, burned out from decades of dealing with municipal bureaucracy and office politics. The cabin was supposed to be my escape from all that, a place where I could restore something with my own hands, fish when I wanted to, and finally have some peace. I spent my first year there replacing the roof, updating the electrical system, and building a new deck overlooking the water. The work was therapeutic, the kind of honest labor that leaves you tired but satisfied at the end of each day. I wasn't bothering anyone, wasn't throwing parties or making noise. Most days, the only sounds from my property were the hum of my table saw or the occasional splash when I launched my little aluminum fishing boat. I thought I'd found exactly what I was looking for. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in March, when I found an official-looking notice taped to my front door. It was from something called the Pinecrest Estates Homeowners Association, informing me that my property was out of compliance with established community standards and that I had 30 days to remedy all violations or face escalating enforcement actions. The violations they listed were absurd. My gravel driveway was unsightly and inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetics. My fishing dock was an unauthorized structure requiring HOA approval, and my vegetable garden was inappropriate agricultural use in a residential zone. I read that notice 3 times, thinking it had to be some kind of mistake. My property wasn't even part of any homeowners association. I'd inherited it free and clear with no covenants or restrictions beyond basic county zoning requirements. The cabin had been there for 60 years, long before anyone had ever heard of Pinecrest Estates. I tried to handle it the diplomatic way at first, because that's how I was raised. I called the number on the letterhead and asked to speak with someone about the notice. The woman who answered later learned her name was Sandra Morrison, had the kind of clipped, condescending tone that immediately put me on edge. She explained that, while my property predated their development, it was now surrounded by and integrated into the Pinecrest community, and therefore subject to their covenants and architectural review standards. When I pointed out that I'd never signed any HOA agreement and that my deed made no mention of any homeowners association, she got snippy and told me that grandfathered properties aren't exempt from community standards and that I could either comply voluntarily or face legal action. I asked for a copy of whatever document gave them authority over my property, and she said she'd have their attorney send me the relevant paperwork. That paperwork arrived 2 weeks later, and it was a masterpiece of legal double talk and wishful thinking. The HOA's lawyer had cobbled together an argument based on something called constructive inclusion, claiming that because my property was now accessed through roads maintained by the association, and because it was visually integrated with the surrounding development, I was bound by their covenants, whether I'd agreed to them or not. The letter cited a handful of court cases that didn't actually support their position, and threw around terms like equitable servitude and community benefit doctrine, and concluded with a demand that I pay 3 years of back HOA dues totaling $8,400, plus another $2,100 in compliance penalties for my various violations. If I didn't pay within 60 days, they threatened to place a lien on my property and begin foreclosure proceedings. I spent that whole weekend reading through the documents they'd sent, cross-referencing their claims with actual property law, and getting more irritated by the hour. The legal reasoning was garbage creative, but garbage. You can't just declare someone's property subject to your HOA because it's convenient for you. And you certainly can't invent dues and penalties for someone who never agreed to be bound by your rules. But I also knew that bad legal arguments don't always lose in court, especially when you're dealing with local judges who might be more sympathetic to a organized homeowners association than to one stubborn holdout. I decided to try one more diplomatic approach before things got ugly. I attended their next monthly board meeting, held in the community center they'd built near the main entrance to their development. It was my first time seeing the full scope of what Pinecrest Estates had become while I wasn't paying attention. The place was impressive. I had to admit, beautifully landscaped streets lined with custom homes that probably started at $800,000, a clubhouse with tennis courts and a pool, even a small marina with slips for residence boats. I could understand why they saw my modest cabin and gravel road as an eyesore that didn't fit their vision of lakefront luxury. But understanding their position didn't make it legal, and it certainly didn't make it right. The meeting itself was a polite disaster. I introduced myself to the 5-person board and calmly explained my situation, that I'd inherited property that predated their development, that I'd never agreed to any HOA covenants, and that I was willing to work with them on any reasonable concerns about my property's appearance. Sandra Morrison, who I now realized was the same woman I'd spoken with on the phone, barely let me finish talking before she launched into a lecture about community standards and property values. The other board members nodded along as she explained that they'd invested too much in creating a premier lakefront community to let one non-conforming property drag down everyone else's investment. When I asked again to see the legal basis for their authority over my land, their attorney, a nervous-looking guy named Peterson, mumbled something about established precedent and community integration standards. I left that meeting, knowing that diplomacy was a dead end. These people weren't interested in working out a reasonable compromise. They wanted complete control over every inch of property they could see from their manicured streets, and they were willing to use whatever legal pressure they could muster to get it. That night, I sat on my deck with a beer and looked out over the lake, thinking about what my grandfather would have done in this situation. He'd been a quiet man, but stubborn as hell when someone tried to push him around. He'd also been smart enough to hold on to that road easement deed when he could have sold it to the county for a few extra bucks back in the day. I had a feeling that decision was about to become very important. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse and spent the day in the records office, pulling every document related to my property and the surrounding area. What I found was fascinating and, as it turned out, extremely useful. The Pinecrest Estates development had been built in phases between 2010 and 2018, with each phase requiring county approval for road access and utilities. The developers had applied for and received permission to use the existing gravel road, my road, as temporary construction access, with the understanding that they'd build their own permanent entrance once the development was complete. But here's where it got interesting. They never built that permanent entrance. Instead, they'd paved over my gravel road, installed fancy stone pillars and a security gate, and started calling it Pinecrest Boulevard. The county records showed that every single home in the development listed the paved road as their address and access route. But nowhere in those records was there any transfer of easement rights or ownership from my family to the HOA or the development company. I spent the next 3 weeks documenting everything I could find. Property surveys from the 1960s showing the original road layout, county permits for the development phases, HOA architectural guidelines that explicitly required all residents to use the main entrance road, municipal utility records showing that water, sewer, electrical lines for the entire development ran beneath what they were calling Pinecrest Boulevard, but what was legally still my private road. The picture that emerged was both infuriating and perfect. This HOA had built their entire community around illegal use of my family's property and had the audacity to demand that I conform to their standards. The harassment escalated while I was doing my research. I started getting violation notices almost weekly for leaving my fishing boat visible from the road, for having excessive outdoor equipment, my lawnmower, and some basic yard tools, for failing to maintain appropriate landscaping standards. They fined me for parking my 10-year-old pickup truck in my own driveway because it didn't meet their vehicle appearance guidelines. When I ignored these notices, as any reasonable person would ignore illegal demands, they started adding late fees and escalating penalties. By November 2022, they claimed I owed them over $15,000 in various fines and fees. That's when they made their biggest mistake. Sandra Morrison sent me a certified letter announcing that the HOA was placing a lien on my property for unpaid assessments and that they intended to foreclose and auction the land to recover their costs. The letter included a date for the foreclosure, auctioned the second Tuesday in December, and helpfully noted that they already had several interested buyers lined up. One of those buyers, the letter mentioned, was Sandra's own son, who was looking for lakefront property to build his dream home. The whole thing reeked of corruption and self-dealing, but I had to admire the audacity. They were literally trying to steal my property to give to the HOA president's family. I let them proceed with their illegal foreclosure process, because I knew something they didn't know. Every single resident of Pinecrest Estates, all 127 homes, depended on my road to access their properties. Without an easement or right-of-way across my land, they were effectively landlocked. The fancy stone entrance they'd built, the security gate, perfectly manicured Pinecrest Boulevard, all of it was trespassing on property that had never stopped belonging to my family. And if they wanted to auction off my cabin and lot, well, they were welcome to try. But the new owner would inherit the same property rights I had, including the right to control access to that road. The community meeting where Sandra announced the auction was packed with residents who'd come to watch the HOA finally solve their problem property issue. I sat in the back and let her talk, watching faces around the room as she described their plans to clean up the cabin site and turn it into something more suitable for their community. A few people looked uncomfortable with the whole process, but most seemed pleased that they'd finally found a way to get rid of the eyesore that had been bothering them for 2 years. Sandra was practically glowing as she talked about the upcoming auction and the bright future it represented for property values in Pinecrest Estates. When she finished her presentation and asked if there were any questions, I stood up and walked to the front of the room. The folder I placed on the table contained copies of every relevant document I'd collected over the past year: the original road easement deed from 1962, county survey maps, development permits, utility records, and a legal opinion I'd commissioned from a property attorney in the state capitol. I opened the folder and spread the documents across the table so everyone in the room could see them. Then looked directly at Sandra Morrison. "Before you auction off my property," I said, keeping my voice calm and conversational, "I thought you should all know that you've been trespassing on my land for the past 5 years. The room went completely silent as I explained at the road. They all used to access their homes. The road they called Pinecrest Boulevard was actually a private easement that had belonged to my family since 1962. I showed them the survey maps proving that their entire development had been built around illegal use of my property. I read aloud from the county permits showing that the developers had only received temporary access rights during construction, rights that had expired years ago, I explained that while they were welcome to proceed with their foreclosure auction, the winning bidder would inherit my property rights, including the right to gate off the road and charge tolls for access. The legal opinion I'd commissioned was the final nail in the coffin. It confirmed what I'd suspected from the beginning, that the HOA had no legal authority over my property, that their liens and foreclosure action were invalid, and that every resident of Pinecrest Estates was indeed trespassing every time they used the road to access their homes. The opinion also noted that, as the legal owner of the access route, I would be within my rights to install gates, charge fees, or even close the road entirely, as long as I provided reasonable alternative access which, given the geography of the area, would require building a new road around the lake at a cost of several $1,000,000. Sandra. Morrison's face went through several interesting color changes as she read through the documents. Her lawyer, Peterson, kept shaking his head and muttering things like, "This can't be right, and we need to verify these records." But the documents were real, and the legal situation was exactly as straightforward as I'd presented it. The HOA had built their entire community on the assumption that they could bully one property owner into submission, and they'd never bothered to verify their legal position before threatening foreclosure. The room erupted after I finished my presentation. Some residents demanded to know how this could have happened. Others wanted to know what it meant for their property values. And a few started talking about suing the developers who'd sold them homes with invalid access rights. Tried to maintain order, but it was clear that she'd lost control of both the meeting and the situation. I gathered up my documents, thanked everyone for their attention, and walked out while they were still arguing among themselves. Asterisk. The aftermath was everything I'd hoped it would be. The HOA's lawyer confirmed within a week that their legal position was hopeless. They had no authority over my property, no valid basis for their liens, and no right to foreclose on land they didn't control. The foreclosure auction was quietly canceled, and Sandra Morrison resigned from the board within a month. Her replacement, a retired businessman named Tom Chen, called me personally to apologize for the harassment and ask if we could work out some kind of arrangement that would protect both my property rights and the residents' access to their homes. I was willing to be reasonable, because that's who I am. We negotiated an agreement where the HOA would pay me $50,000 for a formal easement allowing continued use of the road, plus $2,500 per month in maintenance fees to cover wear and tear on the pavement. In exchange, I agreed to maintain the road in good condition and to give residents 60 days' notice before making any changes to access arrangements. The agreement also included a clause prohibiting the HOA from any further harassment or attempts to regulate my property. But the sweetest part of the whole settlement was the personal apology I received from Sandra Morrison. She came to my cabin on a rainy Thursday afternoon, looking smaller and more defeated than I'd ever seen her. She apologized for the harassment. Admitted that she'd let her personal feelings about my property cloud her judgment, and asked if I could find it in my heart to forgive her mistakes. I told her that I appreciated the apology, but that actions have consequences. And sometimes those consequences are expensive lessons about respecting other people's property rights. Today, Pinecrest Estates is a much quieter place. The residents are polite when they see me around the lake, though most of them keep their distance. A few have actually become friendly neighbors. Tom Chen stops by occasionally to chat about fishing, and the family in the house closest to mine always waves. When they pass, the harassment has stopped completely, and I've been able to get back to what I came here for, fixing up my grandfather's cabin, fishing on the lake, and enjoying the peace I'd been looking for all along. My monthly easement checks cover my property taxes and utilities, with enough left over for a nice dinner in town every month. The cabin looks better than it has in decades now that I've had time to focus on restoration instead of fighting legal battles. I've rebuilt the dock, added a workshop behind the house, and even planted a larger vegetable garden in the spot where the HOA once demanded I maintain appropriate landscaping. Sometimes I sit on the deck in the evening watching the lights come on in those expensive houses across the lake, and I think about how different things might have been if they'd just approached me as a neighbor instead of a problem to be solved. But then I remember the look on Sandra Morrison's face when She realized she'd been trying to auction off the land that controlled access to her own house, and I have to smile.
Oh,